wait, that's coming up. How's everybody doing? Everybody had a good weekend?
Yep. I have a question about the quiz. There were a few questions about best practices, and I tried to refer back to the slides, but I mostly just answered based on what we did on the assignments. Was there any other reference material that we were supposed to be using for that?
Yeah, I know things that we talked about in lecture about using tables or breaking up files into smaller ones, things like that. But yeah, things we covered in class in the lectures. Yes. Let's see.
Hi, Jules. May I ask a question about the quiz?
Sure. What's up?
I've already completed the quiz, like the 15 minutes mode. So I don't know if I need to retake the quiz again or.
Let's talk about it offline. If you want, you can pick me after class.
Okay, thanks.
All right. Welcome everyone. Let's see who's here. Okay, we got 13 folks. So let's give everybody a minute or so to come in. Again, yeah, so the quiz went out early this morning and it'll be available till tomorrow at midnight. So at first I had hoped that we could do the quizzes and the exam during lecture time, but with everybody being in different time zones and being all over the world, I think it's best and it's easier for everyone if you take the quiz on your own asynchronously. So yeah, all quizzes and exams will be available asynchronously, and you will be given 48 hours to complete it. So 2 full days. So it'll start midnight the day before, all through the midnight that day, and then again the following day. As the quiz suggests, the name of the quiz is the topic is HTML and CSS. So if you haven't taken it yet, you'll be asked about a question about HTML, about forms, input fields, checkboxes, acronyms. Make sure you know your acronyms. What what DOM stands for, what HTML stands for. So make sure you know your acronyms. There are a few fill in the blanks. There are a few multiple choice. My A1 hasn't been graded. Yeah, no, definitely everybody's very busy finishing up the grading. I believe most of them are done, so you must. Hopefully, we'll have a grade for you soon. But I'll check with the TAs. All right, so let me share my screen. All right, can everybody see my screen?
Yep.
Okay. All right. Let's see something in the chat. All right, so let's back up and review where we've been and where we're going. Yeah, I'll check on the first assignment. It should be all graded. Sorry, we started. So the first week we focused mostly on introducing the course. We discussed some of the basic technologies such as HTML, CSS, Bootstrap, and then we had a chance to practice the use of these technologies by working on our first assignment, where we created a static web page, several static web pages that link to each other, and we practiced how to create responsive web pages, right? That adapted when you resize the window, so that the same code would be used for rendering for large screen, medium screen, small screens, And so that's what we mean by responsive, right? With no programming, right? It's just declaratively stating using CSS what sizes will we want the screen to be, or our UI to be at different sizes of the screen. So then the next week we spent, the last week we talked about, we introduced JavaScript as a mechanism for being able to manipulate the front end, where we can programmatically control the DOM, right, the document object model. And we saw that we were able to dynamically add content, remove content, manipulate the look and feel by programmatically changing the style of the background color, foreground color, fonts, borders, padding, and be able to replace content using .html, or add new content using .append and whatnot, right? And we saw that we were able to use JavaScript to, on top of using jQuery on top of JavaScript, to be able to manipulate easier the DOM. We discussed that jQuery introduced an abstraction layer on top of the bare bones JavaScript, that because there had been a lot of the language had been fragmented because of the competition between multiple providers, such as Microsoft and Google and Apple and all these players. The language, the JavaScript language, had been fragmented, and this caused a lot of difficulty for developers to be able to target these various browsers consistently, right? So what jQuery introduced, solved this problem by creating a small veneer on top of the low-level JavaScript, so that folks could, instead of having to decide or figure out what browser were they developing for on the fly, they could instead use jQuery, right? jQuery would handle all this, and as long as you interacted with the DOM through jQuery, jQuery would figure out what vendor, what browser version, all that, and it would behave consistently across all browsers. So basically, you were programming, your programs were built on top of a virtual browser as opposed to the native JavaScript browser. Very much like Java does, right? They create a virtual machine where your code is written in terms of this middle language that then gets compiled down to the low-level machine code, right? So that the same code can run in anywhere in any different operating system without you having to recompile it, or without you having to deal with the idiosyncrasies of any one particular operating system. So that's what the jQuery provided us for, right? Now, in this week, we're going to be introducing another layer of abstraction that is going to raise the bar even higher, right? So the lowest level that you can program the browser is just plain old JavaScript, and then you can use jQuery as a thin layer on top of that, which is jQuery is still JavaScript, right? It's still JavaScript, but it provides all sorts of functions that allow you to think about the DOM in a much more consistent way. So on top of that, we're going to be putting React.js. So React.js is an even higher level of abstraction that allows you to think about the web page in terms of not necessarily the DOM, but in terms of components that can be combined together. Simple components that can be combined together to make ever more complex components until you have a full-blown application. It allows to break up a page into multiple functions that are responsible for small bits and pieces of the user interface. Right, it allows you to think about it in reusable, pieces of Legos that out of little bits you can create, fairly complex structures. So yeah, so that's going to be the focus for today and for the next, I would say, another month or so. We're going to be just focusing on React.js and Redux and learning the ropes with React.js. But first, before we do that, I'd like to discuss a little more about JavaScript and the new version of JavaScript. It's a slightly different version than what we've been using for the last week and a half. So we're going to be introducing ES6, which introduces slightly different syntax, which greatly improves the language. So I'd like to introduce that today, and then we'll be ready to talk about React.js. All right. So before we get there, just want to make sure that yeah, the quiz went out right this morning, and that you are have access to that, and you'll be working on that for until tomorrow. The also assignment 2 will be due, I believe, Wednesday, right? And then we'll introduce assignment 3 then, right? Which is React.js. So basically, we're transitioning from kind of like the old guard JavaScript, jQuery, which is still relevant. You know, plenty of websites out there built on top of JavaScript and jQuery, and so, but you know, a lot of industry are making huge investments at moving towards Vue.js, React.js, Angular, and a lot of the more modern ways of building applications. So yeah, so that's going to be today. Today we're going to be introducing the transition from bare bones JavaScript, right, and into the new version of ES6. And then on Wednesday we'll introduce the third assignment. Let's see. Any questions before we get started? All right, excellent. Let's get going.
Oh, sorry, I do have
Yes.
a question. Somebody did made the question in Piazza, but I think it wasn't answered at the end. Last week, there were some buttons, functions, click methods or functions that you put inside of the render function, and they create and they update one outside in the main one. Why is that? Like, why wouldn't it work in the main one?
Let's see. Let's open up the I believe it's this one. I think it was here. Let's see. So I believe you.
Yeah, there where the
here.
delete button. Yeah.
Yes. Well, the thing is that so over here, right, we're inside of this for loop. And in this for loop, we are adding all these rows, right? So these rows don't yet exist when we get to main, right? So when main gets here, right, all these rows, all these delete buttons, right, and the select buttons don't exist yet until we get to find all courses, right? So find all courses fetches the courses from the server, right, and then renders them. So here we don't yet have those buttons; they don't exist yet. Okay, perhaps you can put them here, right? This would be a place to put them. You could move this. You put it right here, but it would have to be done after we know that all those rows, right, have been successfully added to the DOM, right? Once they have been prepended or added or appended to the DOM, and we know we have guarantee that they are in the DOM, then we can refer to them, right? All these buttons, all these, you know, don't exist yet until we actually render them. Does that make sense?
Yeah. So like, I'm just saying also. Sorry, I'm just seeing also like the click. So, is that like an event kind of thing? So like the event wouldn't exist if that's if the courses don't exist either.
So this
right?
this click here, what it's doing is that it's binding this event handler to this DOM element, right? So what it's saying is, what this is saying, hey, if this is clicked, then notify this function, right?
Oh,
Is that?
now I get it. Okay, thank you.
Yeah. Now what you're but you also brought something really interesting, right? If you take out the argument, right, and you don't provide a function, then this essentially is generating an event, right? It's as if you were clicking it, right? So without an argument, right? Without an argument means generate the event, whereas with an argument says read the event, right? So it can be interpreted as a write, right? So meaning create an event, right? As opposed to this, go fetch me the event and then notify this event handler. So most functions in JavaScript, and this is in general in JavaScript in general, not necessarily just on this click. Usually functions have two versions, one with no argument and the other one with an argument. And often it means that that you should interpret it as, if for instance, either as a read or a write, right? Obviously you need to read the documentation, but usually many of these functions, it's a very common style in JavaScript, right? That a function is overloaded, and it means one thing if you pass it one argument, and it means something else if you don't, or a different set of arguments. But yeah, it was a good point that you made.
So in what cases would you use just like click and not function at all? Like, because then an event is created, but if nobody's catching it, unless like you have like an event.
Yeah. Yeah. So for instance, if you're clicking on something on the page and you want also to click at the same time, you want to click several other things, right? Or for instance, oftentimes you have an ugly button and you want to put on top another button that looks much prettier, and then now you want folks to click on the pretty button, but you want to send that event so that the ugly buttons gets clicked. So you can proxy and generate events programmatically. For instance, just the other day I was building a tool that could record when people were clicking on the page, and as they clicked, I would record all the clicks, and then after I had it recorded, I can do a play. I can play all those back, right? And so it would go and programmatically click, right, without me touching the screen. It would click all the buttons and it would play out the and this is a great tool like for testing, right? Where you wanna test an application and see if everything works, right? Instead of me doing it manually, I can record and then play it back any number of times. So it's a very powerful mechanism.
Thank you.
Make sense? Okay. All right. Let's. So first, I've added here a link to ES6. Okay, there's something in the chat. Let me see. Sounds like Selenium. Yeah, exactly, like Selenium. Yeah, I created a mini Selenium. Yeah, so here's this link here. This is a reference link, and this is a really quick list of things that changed between ES5 and ES6, right? And ES stands for ECMAScript. That's the official name. JavaScript is not the official name. It's an unofficial name. And so, yeah, it's very cool. So ECMAScript 5 is what we've been using for the last week and a half, 2 weeks. We've been talking about the plain old JavaScript, right? And this plain old JavaScript, ECMAScript 5, is what most browsers understand perfectly fine, okay? And ECMA6 is what the next version is, and most modern browsers, Safari, Chrome, Firefox, all the major browsers support ECMA6 or most of it, but it's still not fully supported by all browsers, and not all features are supported by ECMAScript 6. But there's pretty good coverage of most of the major browsers. And so this is a list of all the new features. They're really, really cool features. It really brings JavaScript to the modern programming world, that things that features and that you would expect in any modern programming language are now also available in JavaScript. So here it shows several of the things that are different between ES5 and ES6. and we're going to be focusing on ES6 for the remainder of the semester. Okay, so we're going to be introducing it today. We'll go through some examples, and then we'll play around with it. You'll get a chance to practice it with the React.js assignment that is we'll introduce on Wednesday. But I encourage you to go through some of these examples just to get to feel some of the language issues, right, and features. But I have a set of slides here that we're going to go through today, and which will give us a chance to practice some of these new features, right? So this is just a reference, whereas this here is my slides, which capture some of that material from there, but makes slides out of them. Okay. All right. So to practice this, right, we're going to be using a tool called Node.js. Okay. So Node.js. Let's talk about Node.js. So now, when people think about JavaScript, typically they think of the web programming language, right? It's the de facto language that you use to program the web. Okay, and that's true. I mean, most of what you write for a browser is written in JavaScript, and so but JavaScript is so much more, right? It can also execute on the desktop, right? From the command line, like any other language. Just like you can compile Java or C# or Python or any other language, right? That you can create a program and then run it from the command line. Well, JavaScript can do that as well, right? Now, to do that, it needs a tool called Node.js, and Node.js is an interpreter, right, that can read JavaScript files, right, and then execute them from the command line. Now, for the upcoming assignment, you'll need to download and install Node.js, right? So if you head over to nodejs.org, right, you can download the latest version of Node.js, right? So I encourage you to, at your earliest convenience, to download Node.js and install it for your operating system. Okay. So yeah, so once you have that, right, you're going to be able to execute JavaScript files on the desktop. Now, JavaScript files on the desktop, we'll see that there are some limitations. There's some things that you need to consider, and so that's what we're going to be talking about today. So we're going to be, yes,
regarding that, because I have used Node.js a little bit, but the part that I have noticed the most is like it helps you to kind of like what we're doing with the Spring Boot, like see the website and how like the website will like behave like a server kind of situation, right?
Yeah. Node.js is a JavaScript interpreter, just like Java-C is a Java compile code interpreter, right? A language per se is not interesting, right? What's really interesting about any particular language are all the libraries and the communities creating all sorts of libraries and modules that are written for that particular language. Now, Node.js has it's what's most named for, or what's most famous for, is that you can very easily create HTTP servers, right? Like in 3 lines of code, you can have a running HTTP server, okay? And yes, it makes it very, very easy to host a website. Just throw in a couple of HTML, JavaScript, CSS, and boom, you have a Node.js server, and you have a running website. So yes, it's fame is for being able to very easily create servers, but it can be anything, right? Just like Java can be, you can create a program in Java for anything you can possibly think of. We've been using Java in this, up to this point, we've been using Java Server for hosting our HTML and CSS websites, right? But we haven't actually written anything in Java, not yet anyway. And at some point we're going to be using Node.js similarly also when we're going to be implementing our React.js front end, right? We're going to use Node.js to host our React.js applications, right? Even though it's going to be a user interface, right, that's going to be running on the browser, it needs to be hosted somewhere, right? Just like the HTML pages that we wrote and the CSS and the JavaScript that we wrote on the Java server, we're using the Java server to host our HTML, our CSS, our JavaScript. We're going to be using Node.js similarly, but it's going to be hosting React.js front-end applications. Now, on the second half of the semester, we are going to dive into Node.js in much more detail. Okay, we're going to be writing code in JavaScript that runs on the server. From now till for the next month or so, we're going to be writing JavaScript that is hosted by Node.js, but is going to be running on our browser, right? In the second half of the semester, we're going to dive more into Node.js. It's going to be writing still JavaScript code, but it's going to be running on the server, okay? And that's later in the second half of the semester.
Yeah, like it's just my question is because in some kind of way I feel that it's maybe similar to Spring Boot. Like I still don't understand the difference between both of them, because in my experience with both of them is just to create a server in my computer to run my website.
Yes.
So, like, what is actually the purpose of each one?
Yeah, exactly. So we're going to be using Node.js in this first half of the semester only as a server to host our React.js. In the second half of the semester, is not going to host any website.
So the idea of a Spring Boot is actually to have it as a server situation.
For now. Now in 2 or 3 weeks, we're going to expand that quite a bit. It's not only going to host
have other functionalities.
Yes, for instance, it'll need to talk to a database. For instance, it'll need to do ORM. It'll have a controller. It'll have a service. It'll have all sorts of things to be able to talk to the middle tier.
Okay, thank you.
Yep. And same thing. The second half of the semester, we'll do the same thing, but with Node.js. We'll write a middle tier so they can talk to a non-relational database such as Mongo. And have a data model and have a controller and whatnot, but on the server side. Yeah, that's the architecture of what we're going to be building. All right, so so once you install Node.js, you get several executable programs, right? One of them is called Node. The other two that we're going to be using quite a bit are called NPX and NPM. Right, and we're going to be using those three throughout the semester quite a bit, right? So I'll demonstrate how to use them, what they are, and now this is going to assume that you have already installed Node.js, all right? So which I already have, obviously. All right, let me close that. And so, but I'm just going to put it in the chat as a reminder that you should definitely go and visit these websites. Definitely go and visit this website. Okay, so we are going to let me just demonstrate real quick. This is so if I open up create a JavaScript file, I can call it hello.js. Oops, I think I have one too many periods. And here I can just say console log hello world. And so typically you would think that this would be running on a browser, but it's much more than that, right? We can have it run on just a desktop. So for instance, we can go into that directory, into source, and then ES6. And here we have hello, there it is. So hello.js. And I can run it. I can say node space and then hello.js. Enter, and there it is. It says hello world. Okay. So basically that's all really Node.js is, right? It's just an interpreter that allows you to run JavaScript on the command line, right? And like the lady before was saying, a lot of what's become very, very popular is being able to run a server, right, in just 3 lines of code. But we won't be doing that. We won't be doing that for a bit. And so I'm going to be using Node.js so that we're going to create a really simple React.js application, but only so that I can introduce to you the new features of JavaScript. Okay, so let me close this. And from the command line, let's see. Where are we? Up one, up again. Okay, and I'm gonna go into section 2, right? So CDO2. All right, so here we have the Java server. Here we have the Java server. And we're going to create another application here that is going to be our React.js, which we'll fully cover on Wednesday. But I'm only going to create it now so that just to demonstrate the new features of the language. Okay, so I'm going to say, I'm going to be using, you just saw me use Node, right? And Node takes a JavaScript file and then it executes it. I'm going to use another one of the functions that you get, another one of the command lines that you get when you install Node.js, and that's npx, right? So I'm going to be using npx, and I'm going to be using npm quite a bit, okay? So what they stand for, it means Node Package Manager, okay? And this is very common to all languages, right? C#, Java, Python, right? They all have a package manager that allows you to install libraries, allows you to install modules, tools that are specific to that language or to that infrastructure, right? So NPM stands for Node Package Manager. It allows you to install new libraries on your machine, and there's NPX, allows you to run and execute some of these packages. Okay, and now you can find all those libraries if you go to npm.js.com. This is a repository of all the Node Package Manager libraries and tools and whatnot, right? And you can find here anything you can possibly think of is here, right? And these are all open source projects that if you find something interesting, you can find it. You can definitely should start searching here. Chat is Brew? Yeah, exactly, right. Brew is a package manager. Exactly. That's what it is, right? And there's tons of these, right? Depending on which infrastructure you're using, right? In Java, the more common one is you're using the POM file and Maven. Maven is a package manager. When you type MVN, right? MVN is for Java the same thing that NPM is for Node, and what Brew also is on the Mac OS, right? And on the Windows, I forget some of the package managers that are familiar over there. There's also tons of package managers as well. So anyways, NPM, definitely a place to, this is going to be your new best friend. So I'm just going to put it in the chat. So definitely any new package, any package that you can think of, definitely you want to start looking for it here. And actually, if this is all open source, right? And definitely this is a great opportunity for you to create your own packages and then publish them here at NPM. It's free, and then if folks start using it, if you start convincing folks to use your packages, you could get fairly known for having a successful NPM package. Chocolately, yeah. So definitely, this is a great opportunity to say, maybe I'll publish something here in open source, and folks start using it. It's you can become very famous. So yeah, so I'm gonna run, there's one particular package that we're gonna be using. It's called Create React App. So Create React App. No, not React App. There we go. So Create React App is a Node package that was put out by Facebook. So Facebook owns React, right? They're the ones who came up with the React library, and now they open sourced it, and they came up with this tool that allows you to create, very simply, React applications. And the way you implement them uses that you say npx, and you tell it what the name of the package is, right? And so we're going to give it a name, and the name that I'm going to use is going to be based on the naming convention that we're following, right? So it's Januzzi. This is not going to be a server, right? This is going to be a front end, a UI. So I'm going to call it a client, and it's going to be written in React, in React.js. So I'm going to do that. This is going to run for a minute or two, and it's downloading all the packages. What it's doing, right? It's putting together a Node.js application that has all the dependencies that it needs to run a React.js application, right? To be able to host a JavaScript-based user interface front end, okay? And what it's going to allow us to use the latest features of the JavaScript language, and also some of the really cool features that React provides, such as JSX and whatnot, okay? And we'll explain all that. All right, so it's downloading everything. Now, because we're going to be using some bleeding edge features in JavaScript and React.js and whatnot, right? And not all browsers are going to be able to understand what we're going to be writing. Okay, so one of the main one of the main things that Node.js is going to do for us is that it's going to transpile, meaning it's going to compile, or it's going to translate all this high-level JavaScript, ES6, and JSX, and React.js stuff that is very high level. It's going to transpile it down to to a JavaScript version that all browsers can understand. Okay. Eventually, all the browsers will get to the point where they can, they can all understand the greatest and latest, right? And by then, the technology will have moved on, right? And new things will have appeared, right? And we'll always need some transpiling and some compiling down to, something that can be understood by lower level layers. Let's see, something in the chat. Do we plan to use NPM or Yarn? Well, here we're going to be using NPM, but you're welcome to use Yarn as well. So yeah, it's up to you which one, but I'm going to be covering NPM. All right, so it created it. If we go into that directory, so let's go CS web dev, and we're going to go to client, and we can just run it. We can say npm start, and this is going to bring up the React.js application. This is a boilerplate application. It's like the the bare bones hello world application. So there we go. So it's up and running. Okay, so we're gonna leave that alone for a while. We're not gonna do anything with it yet. Let me stop that. Let me open it with my favorite IDE. Okay, this is the Java project. Let's close that. Let me open up the other one, the one we just created. Open. Let's see. This is web dev 2021 section 2, and here's the React that we just created. Okay. All right. So most of what we're going to be doing for the next 2 months, right, is we're going to be spending a lot of time under the source directory, right? But for today, we're just going to be introducing the ES6, right? JavaScript, the latest and greatest of ES6, okay? And we're going to be doing all our work in a JavaScript file here. We're going to call it es6.js, okay? All right, I'm going to add that. Excellent. All right, so we're going to be using this for our IDE, and we're going to be using this for executing. I'm going to move this here. Okay. All right, excellent. Let's see. Let's look at some of the examples that we have here. Let me see, can I make this up? Oh, my machine is breathing like crazy. All right, excellent. So let's take a look at a couple of things. All right, so ES6. Let's talk about ES6, right? Yeah. So the language has introduced a couple of things. One of the things, simple things, is that it has added new ways of declaring variables, right? The ones that we've looked at for the last week or so, right, are declaring variables using the var keyword, okay? And JavaScript works with variables in a peculiar way that allows you to use variables even before you declare them, and this is called variable hoisting. And so in the newer version of JavaScript, they suggest that you instead use the keyword let, where if you try to use a variable before you use it, you'll get an error, right? So which is it's good programming practice, right? That you declare all your variables before you actually use them. So yeah, definitely will let you know that you inadvertently are misusing a variable. Also, they introduced const that allows you to create a constant variable that cannot change its value after it has been declared. Okay, so very simple things. Also, we're going to be using the JavaScript object notation, right, JSON, which is is going to allow. This is not new. This has been around for quite a while, and but I did want to talk about it a bit. Let's grab it, and I'm going to just paste it in here. Maybe if this is on the left and this is on the right, maybe. Maybe. Okay, there we go. Make this smaller. No. Okay, maybe like that. Okay, so this is let's take a look at this real quick. So here's let, and it's creating a variable called some object.js. And let me pretty this a little bit. So let's reformat the code. Reformat the code. Okay, and so this is a just like you can declare a variable as an integer, my integer. You can say 1, 2, 3, right? And you can declare a little string, right? Okay, these are little integers and little strings. One of the things that JavaScript has or lacks are types, right? So unlike other languages, you don't declare the data type of a particular variable. The variable, the type of the variable is implied from the assignment, right? So this one is an integer variable because you are assigning an integer, and this is a string variable because you are assigning a string. This is an object variable, right? Because we are assigning an object, right? This is a little object, just like this is a little string, and this is a little integer that we're assigning. And curly brackets is how you create a new object. An object can contain many properties. So this one has 3 properties. It has an object property, a number array property, and an object array property. You could have any different types of things. So you can put here an integer property, right? So you can put here, an integer. You can say a string property, right? And you can put a string there. Okay. So an object can contain any number of properties, and each property can be of different types, right? Again, it could be an integer, string, an object. Okay. It could be and you don't know the type until you run it, right? A runtime is when we declare the data types. So objects can contain properties. Properties can themselves be, again, objects, right? And then, so they can contain other properties that can then, again, be objects again, right? So you can have, arbitrarily complex objects containing other objects, containing arrays, containing also arrays of objects of arrays. So it could be fairly complex, okay? So for instance, this last one is an array. So it's a property that is an array that contains other objects themselves, right? Now, once you've declared these, you can then refer to them. You can say, I want to grab that object, that some object, and you can use dot notation to then refer to any subproperties, right? So you can say an object property. So I'm referring to this. Notice that my IDE is highlighting it. And I can do a console, right? Console log. Okay, maybe this is too long. I can't see it. Then I can keep going down, right? So dot another object property dot queue. So that brings me all the way down to this queue over here, right? And now okay, let me put this like that. I think that's a little better. There we go. All right, so I can navigate down to the queue, right, by following the dot notation, right? So if I save that and then I run this, oops, no, I didn't mean to do that. I want to go where? I want to go down into source. I want to go down into ES6, and I want to run node ES6. There we go. Okay, notice that it prints 11. Okay, you see that? That means that it printed this 111 here. See that? Okay. So that's not really exciting. One of the things that that you can do with JavaScript is that you can use either a dot notation. Let me copy this. Right. I'm gonna comment out the other one. An alternative way that you can do this is that you can change the dot notation. You can use the dot. You can change the dot notation to be instead use this notation where you can replace the period with a square bracket like that, and this would be a string. Okay, where you can treat the dot notation or objects as if they were maps, right? Where you can use a property as if it were an index, right, into an array. Okay, so if I do that and I run it again, you'll notice that I get exactly the same value, right? Now this is relevant because this notation right here, when you use the dot notation, you have to use exactly the name of this, right? You can't misspell it or whatnot, right? It has to be that. Here, because this is a string, this can be dynamically generated. It can be dynamically calculated on the fly, right? What property you want, okay? And you can dynamically add a property, and you can dynamically remove a property, okay? So, for instance, you can create another object, right? And you can leave it empty with no properties whatsoever. But you can add properties. You can say that another object, right? And you can create a new property, you know, and then you can put values in there, right? And you can put a 1, 2, 3, and you can do a console log another property dot new property. You can print it, and it becomes 1, 2, 3. There it is. So you can generate objects on the fly. You can create maps, right? That you can ask a person, you know, what this field is, right? And you can create these properties on the fly at runtime, which is very, very powerful. Okay, you'll see that definitely, you know, makes the language extremely flexible. Okay, all right, let's continue. Yeah, so just like other languages now, you can use the let keyword, right, to declare variables on the fly, right? So instead of having to declare them all a priori, right, you can declare them at a lower scope. Like, for instance, this X here only exists within this parentheses, right? Nowhere else, as opposed to having to declare this X outside of the for loop at the top. Okay, so that's new. Nevertheless, it's always a good practice, right, to declare all the variables as high in the scope as possible, you know, at the beginning of the scope as possible. Okay, let me skip those. So functions. Also in functions, there's really exciting new features, right, that are going to make it so much easier and so much more compact on writing really nice, clean code. So here's a couple of examples, right? So here's a function written in the old style. Oops, copy, paste. Okay, so this is a function that just adds 2 numbers, so nothing peculiar. Let's use it here. So add, and we add 2 plus 3. Okay, and then we're going to assign it. Okay, and let's just print it. So console log EWQ. Okay, so let's run that. So there it is. So it prints out 2 and 3. This console is printing out A and B. And then the results, we're printing it out as 5. Yes? Nothing peculiar there. But let's look at an alternative definition using the new and improved version, right, of ES6. So let's paste that in there. Okay, let's see something on the chat. Does ES5 have, do ES5 have let? No, I believe it's just var, and let was introduced in ES6. So here we have add 6. So here's the same exact function, but written using what it's called as the arrow function. See that? It's an arrow function. Notice the syntax is different, right? Notice that there's no function. Instead, we just declare like a variable. You know, variable functions are treated like any other variable, right? Just like you can pass a variable, an integer, a string, you can also pass a function just like any other variable, right? So there's no distinction in JavaScript of what you can do with a variable that is just data or it's a function, right? So we declare the variable and then we are assigning it a function. See that? So we declare the variable called add ES6 and we are assigning it a function. A function is basically something that takes arguments and then has a body of execution. Yes? All right. So I'm going to run this and say EWQ. I'm going to use the new version. I'm going to pass it 2,3, and I'm going to print it. Right. I'm going to print the same thing, EWQ, and we should expect to have the same answer. There it is. Right. It prints out the same thing. Okay, so it doesn't look like a big deal until you start looking at some of the things that you can do with this new syntax that you cannot do with the old syntax, okay? For instance, I can, imagine I have another version of this. Let me copy this. And I'm gonna comment this out. I'm gonna leave it that. So I'm gonna show you a new version. Imagine I did not have console. If I did not have console, let me run it, right? Same thing, it prints out 5, but obviously it does not printing, it's not printing the A and B, obviously, right? But because I now have a single line of execution here, see that? It's a single line. The body of this function is now just this return, right? Well, if that's the case, and only if that's the case, I can do the following. I can remove the curly brackets. Okay, I can move this up here, right, and remove the return altogether. Okay, see that? Now, this syntax is so much more terse and compact than the previous one. Okay, and it evaluates to exactly the same thing, the 5. Make sense? Everybody good? Right? But that's only if you just have a return. Right? If you just want to evaluate what it is and then just come back with the results, and you don't want to do anything else. Right? Okay. Right. Excellent. So definitely this is much more compact than having to declare a function like that. Okay. Even if you didn't have the console, it's still easier to just write this like that. Everybody good? Okay. Let's go even further. Right. Let's create another one, and I want to do square. Right. Square. Oops. So square, and so square is going to calculate the square of a number. So say you pass b, right? And we already know that we can just return immediately the result of b times b. Pretty good, right? And let's see, something on the chat. Can we use let instead of const for functions? No, because we're going to use that function is going to be declared. We're not going to reassign a different implementation to that variable, right? It's only going to have that function, and that's it. What confused me is function can be assigned as a const. What confuses me is function can be assigned to a functional parameter. Do we call this kind of terse writing functional programming? Yes. What we mean by functional programming, what we mean by function or functional means that it doesn't maintain, there's no state associated, right? When you call sine, right, the sine of 30 degrees, right, it's always going to give you the same result, correct? If you say the logarithmic of something, right, it'll always give me the same result. So in that case, we say that it's a function, right? Meaning that for a given set of input, it's always going to give you the same output. Yes? That's in contrast with object-oriented programming, where the state of the object is a really big focus, right? And which means, for instance, if you have an object called bank account, right? Well, a bank account has a balance variable, yes? And that balance is stateful. And what we mean by stateful is that it can change over time, right? The state of your account is how much money you have in your account. And you can change the state of the object so that if you call deposit multiple times, you deposit 10, you deposit 20, you deposit, the balance is changing over time. So if you ask for the balance, you get a different value over time. So that's not functional, right? Because you can call the function multiple times, and you can get a different answer multiple times, right? By functional, we mean that it evaluates same inputs, always gives the same outputs, and that's going to be important when we get a little later. For React, we are going to follow the functional style. Yes, we are. Yeah, exactly. This is going to play into later on when we get to React.js, and we're going to implement React.js applications using functions, right? First, we're going to introduce classes, and we're going to introduce state, and we're going to say, well, you can do it this way, but a better way of implementing it would be using functions, right, that are stateless. And we're going to spend some time talking about why stateful, why it's stateless, why is it better to leave it as a function of programming as opposed to as a stateful class, right? And we'll discuss the pros and the cons. We'll first show you how to do it stateful, and then we'll show you how to do it stateless, right? And we'll say why is one better than the other. Let's see, question in the chat. Thank you. Yeah. But just as a peek, why is stateless functions better than stateful classes is that definitely it makes it easier to test something that is functional. If you know that in the add, if you have an algorithm that adds two numbers, and if you give it the same numbers, it's always going to give you the same response. It's much easier to test a function that is stateless, as opposed to if you try to test an algorithm that has state, meaning that depending on the value and the time and the progression of the application as it changes its state, to test this, it becomes a very, very complex. The number of states can explode exponentially, and testing such applications can be very, very difficult to test, right? So as much as possible, we're going to try to make our application as stateless as possible, right? Again, for testing purposes, for application development purposes, it's so much easier if it's stateless functions. Anyway, that's way too ahead of myself. I'm sorry. Yeah, so we have here a square, and we're going to use it to calculate the square of 4. Okay, and then we're going to do console log EWQ. Right, so if we run that, it's as you expect, is 16, right? Okay, nothing new there, right? But because this has a single argument, we can use an alternative syntax, right? I'm going to copy it, right? I'm going to now, because it's a single argument, notice that I can't do it this for this has 2 arguments. This has 1 single argument. So I can, now the parentheses are optional, right? I don't have to have the parentheses, right? So if I run this again, it still works. It gives you 16, okay? Now, again, this might not be such a big deal. And some might say that this is even harder to read, right? Actually, if you have a function like this and you declare it this way, right? You should put the parentheses. Okay, you should definitely put the parentheses. This makes it so much easier to read. But I just want to point out that if you only have 1 argument, it is optional, and I'll show you where this shines, right? Why is this relevant? Okay. Now, because we were able to rewrite, right, something that looks, as ugly as this, as terse as that, right? This is going to allow us to write, lambda functions and embedded functions, anonymous functions in so much easier syntax to read. All right, let's take a look at some of the what this buys us. All right, let's talk about what this buys us. Okay, so we have adds, we have square, blah blah blah. Okay, here we go. The keyword this. Let's wait on that first. Before we go into the use of the great things about the arrow function, before we could do that, there's a word on this keyword. Right, I had mentioned that in the version ES5, the version that we just covered last week, right? The keyword this, right, has different meanings depending on the scope that you're using it, right? It's basically it's always in the narrowest scope that you're in, right? So if it's in the class, well, then this is referencing the instance of that class. If it's inside of a function, then it's within the instance of that function, okay? So now this is completely unintuitive for those folks that are coming from Java or C# or from any other language, right? In those languages, this keyword always points to the instance of the class, right? So in ES6, that's exactly how this behaves, right? This behaves in line with other modern languages, right? The keyword this, it's unambiguously now always tied to the context of the class instance, right? Wherever you use it in your code is the class instance. So that's definitely a big improvement. Another thing about functions is that even though a function might take any number of arguments, A, B, C, D, X, Y, Z, any number of arguments, you don't have to pass all those arguments, right? When you call the function, right, you can only pass 1, 2, 3, as many as you want, okay? And so the function, you can declare it to take default values if by any chance you don't pass those values. If you don't pass me a Y, well, I'm just going to take a default value of 7. If you don't pass me a Z, I'm going to take a default value of 42, which is pretty cool. All right, let's talk about arrays. All right, so here's our first example of using the arrow function, the terse, compact feature of the arrow function. Here's an example, for instance. Let's look at this filter function, right? So the filter function is a function that you can call on an array. So an array in JavaScript, you declare an array just by using the square brackets. See that like that, right? So you can say I'm declaring a variable all that has these 10 values, these 10 integers. So arrays have this function called filter, right? Let me just show it to you. So I'm going to copy this and I'm going to bring it over here. There we go. Okay, and we're going to print out. We're going to say console log. We can print the array. We can also print the even and odd, right? So this is a new syntax for the log, right? Where you can put different variables, right, separated by commas. See that, right? So if we run that, there it is, right? So notice that we are displaying the first array all. There it is. We're just displaying the values 1 through 10. Notice that it formatted this way so that it would fit on the screen, which is pretty cool, right? And then it printed out the even, and then printed out the odd. See that? Okay. So let's revisit this code. Let's revisit this code. Let's look at filter. So filter is a function that you can call on an array, and like the name suggests, right? It filters the array, right? It filters the array, and it comes back. It returns a new array, right? It only returns the values, right, that meet a particular Boolean expression, right, that you can put in there, right? So notice this syntax. Do you notice something in the syntax? What is this? That's an arrow function. See that? It's a function. So filter takes as argument a function. And that function, if that function returns true, then filter will keep that value. If it returns false, it will skip over the value. Okay? So let's revisit this function here. What is this? The function is, here's the argument to the function, here's the arrow, and that's the body of the function. See that? Right? Let me rewrite it for you. See if you can make it out. Right? So let me rewrite it for you. Okay, so this is a function, so I'm going to put a parentheses, and this is what? This is the body, right? And this is the return. See that? That's a function. That's a function that takes an argument I. So filter, what it does is that it calls the function. It calls the function with every single element in the array, right? And the function returns either true or false. Is this true or is it false? Basically, it's saying if the modulus 2 of the number is equal to 0, that means that it's divisible by 2. That's even. Right? So it's going to keep the value. If it's not modulus 2, then it skips it, meaning it's not divisible by 2, so that means that it's not even. Right? So let's see on the chat. Is this different than ES5? Okay, if this is different, what's the difference of code in assignment 2? Let self equal this. Exactly. So in assignment 2, we're using ES5, right? So we're basically using, so let's go back. Sorry, I skipped over that. Yeah. So because this, right, has a different interpretation, but I want to keep the original value of this that is referencing the class so that it behaves the way I learned how to use this in Java or C#, right? So to get around the weird behavior of this in ES5 is that you typically assign it to a variable self, and then you use self to store the original value that was pointing to the class, right? So that you can then use the class the way you intended, the way we mortals, all intend how this works, right? So that's how we're using this variant on assignment 2. Okay, but now that we're introducing ES6, we're not going to have to worry about having to do that anymore. Okay, let's see the chat again. Triple equal checks type as well. Yes, right. Triple equal checks. Yeah, exactly. What is triple equal? Right. So the double equal. So the problem with double equal is that double equal will cast the values, right, to see if it can do a match. So for instance, the number 1 would be equal to character 1, right? Because it'll cast the character into an integer, and then it'll make the comparison, and they're the same, right? But triple equal will check to see if the data types are the same first. If the data types are not the same, then it doesn't even bother, right? It does not cast anything. It just fails it. Okay, so you should always use triple equal. Yeah, so equal would consider exactly as equal. Perfect. Yep. Good questions. Where was I? All right, I was here. Yeah, so this, right, is an alternative writing for this. So if I run this will work the same way. There it is. It works the same way. Or you can use the old style, right? You can use the ES5. In ES5, it would be written as follows, right? It would be written as function, right? And then just the curly brackets. See that? That's the old style ES5 style, right? And this would behave the same way. Okay, but we are abandoning this syntax, and instead we are going to keep this much more terse, right? Very compact way of writing the same exact thing. Everybody good? All right, excellent. Okay, even all filter with, yeah, we're looking at the old notation. Now, yeah, so be careful, right? Be careful, especially when you start debugging this code. You know, be careful. Say you decide that you want to print these values, right? Say you have a bug, right? And it's iterating, right? And it's not coming up with all the even numbers. So you're wondering, is this something wrong with the values of I? Let me print that into the console. Let me print it to the console, right? So one of the things that you might try to do is type here console, right? Console log I, semicolon. Okay, notice that this is a syntax error, and you say, okay, this doesn't seem to work. How about if I split it into 2 lines of code? Notice that this is still a syntax error, right? This is still a syntax error because the arrow function without the curly brackets only works if you have a single line and it's an implied return. Yes? So for this to have a good syntax, that you would have to have this embedded inside of a curly bracket. All right, so I'm going to put curly brackets around this. There we go. Okay, we're not done. We're not done. Okay, now this, what is that? That's a Boolean expression. It's not a statement. Right? Console is a statement, but this is a Boolean expression. It's not a statement. So I have to convert this into a statement, which is a return. Okay, and I know a lot of you are going to get stuck with that, and as you're coding in React.js, because we're using ES6, and you are trying to debug something and it's working, and it says, why isn't this working? And most of the time, or a lot of the time, I've seen folks run into this syntax error, and folks just waste hours on something as simple as this. So please try to remember this. Okay, right? And sometimes after you do this, it says, okay, I get it. I want to get it back to what it was. Okay, and some folks will remove this, and we'll get all hung up on forgetting, do I remove the curly brackets? Do I have to leave the return? Right? To try to come back to this, right? To these slides, right? And look at some of the syntax, right? And notice there's no semicolon, there's no curly brackets, there's no return, right? It's as terse as this. Okay. All right. Just be warned. All right, another one, mapping. So mapping is another function we're going to be using quite a lot, throughout the semester, right? So map, what it does, right, is that it takes an array and it iterates over that array, and for each element in that array, it calls a function. Again, it's using the terse ES6 syntax arrow function. Yes, and what is it doing? Well, what map does is that it calculates a new array, right? It computes a new array, and the values of that new array will be whatever the function returns, right? So for instance, if I have all here, let me copy this, okay? And do I have all? I guess I have all. And I guess I already have a function called square. There it is. Let me comment that out. Yeah. Okay, so here I'm declaring a variable all, and what it's doing here, it's iterating over these values, and it's passing each item to the function as an argument, and the function is returning the square, right? And what it's doing is that it's calculating a new array whose values are going to be the squares of the all, right? So let's print it out. Let's see, we're gonna say console log, we're gonna say all and square. Okay, so let's run that. There it is, right? So it's coming up with 1, 2, 3, 4, and then 1, 4, 9, 16. See that? Okay, this is such a useful function. This is, this is going to be our bread and butter for the next 2 months. Right? We're going to be using map all the time. Okay, in React.js, it's such a common and useful function. Right? So a lot of it. Right? So definitely, we're going to become very, very intimate with that function. Here are a couple of other ones, right? So we're going to calculate the filter and find. So find, it takes an array and it iterates over that array, and then it finds the first item in the original array that meets this Boolean, right? Whenever this returns true, the iteration stops, right? And it comes back, the result is going to come back with the item that meets that criteria. So is 1 greater than 3? No. Is 3 greater than 3? No. Is 4 greater than 3? Yes. So this whole thing returns 4. Okay. Find index does the same thing, but instead of returning the item, it returns the index where it found it. So for instance, this is index 0, 1, 2. It will return 2. Okay, let's see on the chat. So for find, the order of the elements in the array would matter, right? For find, yes, right? Because if I had a 5 here, right, it would find 5 first. Yes. Okay, so filter instead of finding the first one, it can retrieve all the elements that meet a criteria, right? So for instance, find all the ones that are greater than 3. So this will return 4 and will return 5. Right, there we go. Right, so filter just removes, well, it doesn't touch the original array. All right, it just computes a new array with that criteria. Right, string interpolation. So we've used this before in the last assignment, where you can use the tick mark, right, instead of double quotes or single quotes, where you can calculate long strings. Right, we can calculate long strings based on expressions. Right, so here we have some variables, customer and card, that are objects, right, that have property name, and card has properties amount, product, and unit price. And then we're building a big string in terms of some static strings and some expressions. See that? So here we have customer name, so it's Alice. So it says, hello, Alice, right? Want to buy, and so card amount is 7. So this would be, want to buy 7, then product is bar, right? So bar for a total of, and then here's an expression, right? We're going to multiply amount and unit price. So we're multiplying 7 times 42. So whatever that evaluates to, right? For so many bucks. Yes? So yeah, so again, we're going to be using this quite a bit in React.js coming up. In the chat, is this how email marketing softwares are built? Creating templates. Part of it, yes. All right, array matching. All right, so in most languages, you can use arrays, and you can declare an array, and then you can use the square notation to extract values from that array and assign it to a local variable. So that's nothing new, right? You can do that in JavaScript again, obviously, right? Well, in ES6 they introduced this syntax, right? Now this new syntax is called destructing. Just like constructing an object means that you're putting data into an object, destructing is extracting data from an object, right? So for instance, if you have a data structure here that has 3 items in an array, you can retrieve data from that data structure using this syntax. You can say var a comma comma b, right? So this is saying, it uses the index, right? This is saying a is going to be equal to the first element of the array in list. Then I want to skip over the second element, and then the third element. I want B to take the value of the third element in list. Let's see, something on the chat. Would filter be a good choice to filter information such as the dashboard page filter? Group by, yeah, exactly. Yes, perfect. That'd be a great example for that. Yep. Yeah, we're going to use filter a lot. You know, like for instance, doing things like that, right? I want to, you have a big array and you want to display different things in different places, right? When you to use filter. Yep. Yeah, so this is destructing and retrieving data from an array. You do the same thing with objects, right? Say you have an object, right, that has A is equal to 1, 2, 3, B 2, 3, 4, and so on and so forth, right? So you have an object with properties. Well, you can destruct the object, right? In the old way of doing it, with ES5, you would just say temp.a, temp.c, you know, to retrieve each one of the items. Yes, but that's so old school, right? The new syntax is much better. You can put you can declare variables A and C, right, and assign it temp. What's going to do is that typically, you know, remember, data flows from right to left, right? So we're taking the values in temp, which are A, B, C, and D. And what this is doing is that it's extracting data from temp, the properties A and the properties C, and assigning them to variables A and C. Now, these variables have to be called, for this to work, these values have to be called the same as the properties that you are extracting or you are deconstructing from the object. Very, very powerful. We're going to be using this all the time in React.js. Here's an example of its use. So for instance, if you have a function h and you pass it, right, you pass in an object bar, you know, name bar value 42, you can extract the values for name and value by just saying argument.name, argument.value, right? So that's common. That's, you know, we all know how to do that, right? Nothing new there. This is how you would do it using ES5, the old school way, right? The new syntax is that you can use this much terse syntax, right? You can say, you can pass the same object, pass the exact same object, but you can now use the deconstructing syntax, right, to extract the value of name right here, and extract the value of val right here. So name will now get the value of bar, and this will get the value of 42, and then you can just log, console log, right? So this is so much more terse, right? So much more compact. You know, just these two little curly brackets, right, replace, right, all this, you know, all this nonsense, right? Declaring the variables, you know, doing the dot notation, right? So much more terse and much easier to read. You can also rename the variables, right? If locally you want to use a different name other than the actual properties that you're passing, right? You can declare alternate optional names for those variables locally in the function. But this is fairly rare or necessary. It also works with arrays. If you pass an array, right, you can use a destructor, right? The destructor array that we saw earlier, right? And then, but this works with indices, right? So this would be the first index, right, gets assigned to the second index, and so on and so forth. Well, which brings me to the back here, right? If we so this you could have implemented it this way, right? So if you have h, actually we don't even need the curly brackets, right? We don't even need the curly brackets. So let me rewrite this like that. Okay. You can also implement it this other way, or the order here doesn't matter. Comma val. Okay, notice that the order of this doesn't matter, right? Because you are extracting it by the name of the property. See that? By the name of the property. Val, name. Now, if it's an array over here, the order does matter, right? Here, name gets bar and val gets 42. If I change this around, right, then, you know, the opposite, then this would get the other values and whatnot, flipped. So careful, right? In arrays, the order matters. In an object, the order does not matter.
Professor,
Yes.
in that last slide, this might get confusing, but since it's technically, or the one before that, since it's technically like a tuple, which means it's like just one parameter, does that mean that you can also remove the parentheses? Oh, one down from there. You know how you were cleaning it up? Yeah, that one. I was just curious. You see
Here?
the parentheses on the parameters in the signature?
Okay.
Since it can you remove those since it's
No, you
technically
can't
just
remove it.
one
No,
tuple?
when you're using a destructor, you need the parentheses. Yeah.
Okay. Oh, okay. Good. Yeah, good
Yeah.
to know. Just wondering.
Yep. Good. Yeah, good catch. Excellent. All right, another syntax we're going to be using quite a bit is that if you are creating a brand new object like this, right, and you are assigning variables, like for instance, you have X and Y, and those variables are the same as the properties, right? So for instance, it would be X colon X and Y colon Y, right? So what ES6 allows you to do is to use the shorthand where you don't have to provide both the property and the variable that you're assigning. You can just say X comma Y, which expands to this, right? So internally, this is what it expands to, but you can use the shorthand. And again, this shorthand is very widely used in ES6 programming. Okay, and we're definitely going to be using this quite a bit. The other thing that React ES6 introduces is modules. So modules, right? It introduces modern ways of importing and exporting different functionality from files, right? So typically now with the ES5, the way you load files is that you say, script source, and then you point to a file. Yes, and then you have to load all those files that you need at the top level or wherever you need it in the page. Yes. Now the problem with that is that they are all going to be shared in the same page in the same namespace, right? So if one file declares variables and functions and whatnot, you run the risk that later files that you load, if they declare a function of the same name or a variable of the same name, they're going to overwrite, right, any previous declarations. Okay, there's going to be collision. There's going to be collisions in the names and the function. That's why we introduced the iffy pattern, right? In the previous assignment, we wrap our code inside of parentheses, a function that self-executes. Yes, that's how we dealt with it in ES5. In the chat, are we going to build a new re-op for client React? A repo, yes. Are we going to create a brand new repo? Yes, for our React applications, we're going to have a brand new repo. At the end of the course, we're going to have about 3 to 4 different repositories, one for the Java server, one for the React front end, and one for the Node.js server, okay? If we have time and we can play around with Angular or Vue, then we'll declare another repository for that as well. You'll notice, if you've worked in an industry, right, it is very common that projects of any large considerable size will have multiple repositories, right, with all sorts of things running in different places, and you need to learn how to integrate all these pieces, right? And that's what we're going to be doing in this class, right? We're going to have all these 3 repositories deployed in 3 different servers, and they're all going to be talking to each other, right? Very, very cool. So I was saying, when you load all this JavaScript, right, you run the risk that they overwrite each other, right? So to deal with this, ES6 introduces the fact that each file, that you declare any code in that file is self-contained, right? It is completely opaque to the outside world, right? So nobody can see inside of their file any function you declare in there, any classes, any variables, unless you explicitly export, right? So for instance, if you have a function in Math.js called sum, and you have a variable called pi, and you want other folks to use it, you need to explicitly export it. Okay. making these functions available to the rest of the world. And this it doesn't literal the namespace. All folks can then they need to explicitly import, right, those libraries or those functions from those files, right? So you need to export it and make it publicly available, and then you need to import it for whatever you want, right? Now you can import the entire file or the entire functions or variables that have been declared public or that have been exported, right? And then assign it a local qualifier so that you can then reference all what's in that file, right? Or you can use the destructor syntax to specify exactly what you want, right? It says, oh, I only want these variables or this function, right? I don't want all of them, okay? So the destructor syntax added again, yes. You can also declare certain things to be exported by default, right? So that anything that you declare as exported by default, you don't need to use the destructor, right? It's that function will be readily available, right? And you can only declare only one, right? You can declare only one function to be the default, okay? So that if you're importing and you don't use the destructor, then you must mean that you're importing the default. Okay, so here's the default of this function. Okay. Again, that too is going to be very, very often going to use that. Also, the ES6 introduces classes, and these are real classes, right? Not the rinky-dinky classes that we had in ES5, where we have a function that can be treated like a class. No, this is a real class, very intuitive, very what you would expect from any serious, mature programming language. Okay. So just like any other class, it has a constructor where you can pass in arguments, and then you can bind those arguments to local variables using the this keyword. This dot and then the key and then the local variable. You can also bind and use functions declared inside of the class. You also have inheritance, right? Full-blown inheritance. Not the the toy inheritance that ES5 had. This is really inheriting like you would any other object-oriented programming language, where you inherit all the methods from the parent. You can also use from the constructor of your derived class. You can use the superclass, right? You can call your superclass and pass it arguments so that it will be initialized so that you get all the behaviors from your parent. And then you would initialize your local variables. Like all the languages, super needs to be the first language. The first must be first line in constructor. And that's very common in all programming languages. Yes. Then you also get setters and getters, right? Where you can declare functions, right, that will be used to either write to a class variable or read from a class variable. And notice the syntax I mentioned earlier, right? That's very common in JavaScript, right? Where you have a function that has two versions. One of them can take an argument and is often for writing to, right? Or you have a variation that takes no arguments for reading. So one would be for read and one would be for writing. Okay, very common. And then you can use them. You can use them as regular variables, right? Where you can either use it in an expression as a Boolean expression. You can use the equal to assign, and it would use the set, although we don't have a set for area. Or you can right, if you're using an expression, it would use the get. Okay, so very, very powerful. What else? We have a static members, right? If you use the static keyword, right, meaning that to access these member class members, you have to use the class name in front of it to access the either a variable or the function. And finally, you can declare functions in your base class, which you can then use in your derived classes, right, using the super keyword. Okay. Again, all this is very, very common to all to most object-oriented, programming languages. All right. All right. Excellent. Yeah. So let's now let's take a look at the React project we just created 2 minutes ago, right? Which is going to use everything we just talked about, right? Which is going to be very, very common in React applications, right? So before we do that, I do want to give you a little background on React.js. Right? So let me give you just a 25 words or less on React.js. So first of all, React.js is a library, right? It's not a framework. It's a library. It's a JavaScript library that allows you to implement single-page applications very easily. Okay. So what is a single-page application? So a single-page application is an application that loads a page once and then never again, right? And grabs the DOM, it takes control over the DOM of that page, and then it dynamically manipulates the content in that page, right? By using things such as jQuery to dynamically add to that page or remove or modify content in that page dynamically without ever reloading the page, right? As opposed to, right, the classical way of implementing applications is that, for instance, in the first assignment, I had you navigate between login and register and profile, right? And the way that would happen is that you would click on a hyperlink, and the old document would be removed, and the new document would be replacing that old document, right? And then you had kind of like an animation, right? That you would see something at once, and then you would see something else next. Yes. And then, as you navigate, you click links. You would dump the old HTML, the old DOM, right? And then you would replace an entire new DOM on top of it. Single-page applications don't do that, right? What single-page applications would do instead is that it would load an empty document that has nothing, and then use the server to go fetch data, and then once it has the data, and maybe some snippet template code, right? It would calculate what it would dynamically append, either using jQuery, right, or using the techniques we learned about last week, and we were working on the assignment, right? It would replace the DOM content dynamically without actually throwing away the whole DOM and reloading an entire document, right? And it would add and remove content dynamically, and you would see the navigation. You would see different pages, different, just like you would navigate normally from one page to the next. But the effect is so much smoother. It's not as jarring as just dumping an entire document and just replacing with a brand new document. Yes. I think the first time that the relevance of this became apparent to me, well, what's the difference, right? You are just replacing one thing with another thing. Why is it so relevant? So for me, the first time that it became obvious how important this technique is when I saw the very first time I used Google Maps. Right, is when I realized the power of single-page applications. And I don't know, this must have been, 10 years ago, 15 years ago, I forget. I mean, it's been a while since Google Maps. But before Google Maps, I used to use another mapping application called MapQuest. I don't know if you remember MapQuest, but the old way of implementing Google Maps would be that you had a page, yes, and then you had the map, and if you want to zoom, right? You would click a button, and then the whole document would be dumped away, and it would reload an entire new document, but the image was closer, right? And if I want to pan right, I would click on the right button, and again, it would dump the whole thing, and it would recalculate a new HTML document, and it would re-render the whole thing, but the map would be moved right a little bit to the right. Obviously, with the network speed and how fast your browser would be, right? You would almost it would be indistinguishable, right? You would be able to click on that button, many times. You would see the thing move fairly quickly, right? Nevertheless, right, when compared to the way Google Maps implemented it, right, where you can grab the map and start jiggling it around, right, and move it, and then just flick it. Flick the map, and you could see the animation as new maps were being added to the emptiness of the earth, right? It was a like night and day, right? And the smoothness of being able to zoom in and zoom out without the jarring effect of throwing away the entire page, right, and then replacing it with something new. It was just night and day, the application, right? So today, most front-end applications are implemented with single page techniques, right? So if you go to Twitter.com, right? Notice the spinning, right? So basically, it's making a query, right? It's going out to a server, and it's retrieving data, right? And being able to retrieve all this data, and then dynamically adding or appending each one of these tweets, right? And putting here the content dynamically in here. Okay, much different than how today the applications are implemented, right? As opposed to that jarring of content, right? That gets rendered if you replace the entire HTML document. Okay. So we're going to be focusing for the rest of the semester in single page applications, right? All right, so let me demo the simplest of applications, okay, that we just implemented 2 seconds ago when we created our first one. So let's see. Let's take a look at this React application. Let's run it. I'm going to run it again from the terminal. So this will be, I'm going to say, I'm going to run it. I'm going to say npm start. So this is going to bring up the boilerplate default React application. And there it is, right? We see that we have a spinning image. We have some text here. We have a hyperlink. Okay. And if you inspect the content, let's put it side by side. You see that the content has, let's see, it has a head, it has a body, right? There's a div here with an ID of root. We have another div here. We have a header. Okay, we have the image, and that's the spinning image right there, right? We have the paragraph underneath. We have the hyperlink. We have the header div. Okay. All right. So let's look at this head. Let's look at this body. Let's look at this div. Let's look at the chat. It says, is 3000 the default port for Node.js? Yes. 3000 is a very common port for developers to use when they're running or testing things locally. Yep, that's a very common port. So I just want to point your attention to this div root here. Okay, yeah, don't forget that. And then you have all this content in here with the image and whatnot. Okay, all right. So let's take a look at the index page for that page. So the landing page for this application is right here, this index. So let's open it up. Let's see what's in here. All right, so if you look at the content of this index page, you have the HTML, you have the head, you have meta, right, blah, 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 blah. You have these links, you have this title, React, you have the body, you have the non-script, and you have the root. That's it. Where's the rest of the content, right? We have an empty root, But we just checked and we saw that root has actual content. Where is all that content? Well, it's not here, okay? Again, playing into the technique of React.js, dynamically adding and injecting content in here as the application evolves over time. As you interact with the application, it will add different content here, right? Giving you the capability of implementing single page applications, right? The content is actually down here, right? The real entry point is this, right? That HTML, really what it's loading is this JavaScript. This is the root JavaScript called index.js, which is doing some magical things, right? Some things here you might already know what sort of is happening, right? What's import? We just talked about import allows you to load certain code, certain classes, certain variables from other files, right? And React looks like that's a default. Something has been exported as being default, right? Same thing, React DOM must have been exported as default. You can load CSS files as well. This is with this app, right? And this here you have something that we don't know what it is, but we'll know eventually. We'll know. But I just want to point out this over here. See this? This is the root. See that root? So this is boilerplate, low-level JavaScript, right? This is low-level JavaScript is saying, go fetch me that element that has the ID root, okay, which happens to be this div. See that? Right? So what this is doing is that React DOM render is saying, render this and inject it into the root element. See that? Right? It's going to render whatever that is, right? And we'll know what that is eventually. It's going to inject it and put it in there. Okay? Now, what's this app? So app is this app over here, right? But notice that it's, wait a minute, what is this? What is that? Is that a variable? Is that something that's being loaded? And notice that it's being used as if it were an HTML element. What is that all about? And what's this weird element, opening tag and closing tag here? What is that all about? Well, we're going to be learning, right, that the HTML that we've seen so far, right, that's a standard HTML that was designed so many decades ago, right? And has been revised every so often, right? We are at HTML5. Well, we're going to learn now that we're going to be able to create our own tags, right? If you don't like HTML, that's okay. You can create your own HTML, right? And the browser is going to be able to understand it just fine, right? So here's a tag that we created here. We can navigate. How do we create tags? Well, we can navigate in there, and it so happens that a tag is simply, right, a JavaScript function. That's all it is. That's all it is. It's a JavaScript function that has a return, and whatever that function returns, look what this function is returning. It's returning this big div here. See that? And what is that? Right? Whatever that function returns is going to replace that tag. So that app there, that tag app, this is going to be replaced with whatever this is, whatever this function returns. See that? Okay. So what this is going to allow us to do, is to apply normal software engineering practices of breaking up large programs into smaller functions, right? So that we can tackle big problems in terms of ever smaller little functions that we can combine to build something big, right? Right. So basically, this is what we call in programming, right, abstraction layer, right? You can create an abstraction. When you create a function, for what? Because you have an algorithm, right, that you want to reuse, and you want to parameterize it. you want to pass parameters, and that algorithm is going to calculate something that you want to repeatedly call with different parameters. Well, that's exactly what React.js does. It says, I'm going to allow you to package HTML inside of functions so that you can invoke, right, those functions as many times as you want, right? So you can reuse it. And it's a function, so you can pass me parameters, and those parameters can be used to programmatically decide what you want to show or what you don't want to show. So you can calculate this content dynamically using ES6 and all the great stuff that we're going to be introducing you in the next couple of weeks, right? Another thing, notice, what is this? This app, header, image. Wait a minute, we've seen this. What is that? It's this. It's right here. See this div class app? There it is, div class app. And there's our header. There's our header right here. See that? And the image. There's our image right there. So this is the content that is being added here. And this whole thing, whatever that is, right, is being injected into the root. And that's what the root renders. The root renders this right there. And that's how it gets dynamically added into the root. See that? So the other big question here is that, what is this? I mean, we have JavaScript, right? Whatever this new JavaScript is, we just learned 2 seconds ago, right, today, about this new syntax of importing and exporting and all this, right? But then we have like embedded HTML here. We didn't see that. That's new, right? I mean, we've seen something like that in our previous, in our other project, where we were using, you know, backticks from jQuery, right? That we were generating dynamic HTML from jQuery using backticks, yes, and using templates, $, and square, and curly brackets and all that, right? And so that approach is, you know, is fairly error prone, whereas this approach here that allows you to embed, you know, seamlessly JavaScript, seamlessly, you know, intertwined with HTML, allows us to embed code and logic, right, inside of our HTML, or we can embed HTML into our code, or code into HTML. It's so seamless, right, that sometimes you forget, right, what is it that you're embedding where. Let's see, chat. Where should we add curly brackets around variables? For example, source logo. When should we add around variables? Always. Well, you know, whenever you have it embedded inside of HTML, here is, notice the curly brackets here, right, allows you to escape, right, and embed here variable names, right, so that they can be evaluated, as opposed to anything that is not in a curly bracket is considered to be static, right, that should not be interpreted, that should be sent to the DOM literally, right? Whereas if you have a curly bracket, usually that means that what's inside of that curly bracket is an expression, right? Either a variable or something that needs to be evaluated, and the value that it comes back is what ends up being added to the DOM. Okay. One more thing here, it says, what is this class name? I mean, I know class. We've been using class in HTML for a while. Is that the same? Yes. Now, because class is a reserved keyword in ES6, class is a reserved keyword, so you can't use class willy-nilly, right? So instead, in here we're going to be using class name to mean class, right? So this syntax of being able to embed seamlessly JavaScript and HTML, that syntax is called JSX. JSX. So JSX, right, allows you to seamlessly embed HTML inside of JavaScript. We're going to be using this quite often, you know, for the next couple months. In JSX, JavaScript values are referenced. Yeah, curly brackets. I read this from React, and yep, we're going to be using that quite often, quite a bit.
Professor?
Yes.
Quick question. I hope this isn't too off topic, but coming from an Angular background here, is there like a way to like reference like a .html file and just return like no? So it's
No.
always in line like this.
Yes,
The HTML is always in line like this when you return it.
Yes, it is. Yes, and
Okay.
Angular is very, very adamant about separating the HTML and the JavaScript because they follow model view controller very strictly.
Okay.
And they separate those two very, very clearly, and they never cross, right? And so
whereas React is like intentionally crossing them.
Yeah, React.js goes the other way around and says, no,
Okay.
we're going to intentionally cross.
Okay, all right, this is good to know. Thank you very much.
Yeah, they went like the opposite way. Something on the chat it says, yeah, okay. Yeah. So we're gonna be using this quite often. Yeah, so there were, I think there were one of the things that React.js tried to address was there was some complaints in the Angular community that it was fairly rigid and forcing people breaking it up into a specific architecture. And React.js says, you know what, I'm not going to follow any architecture. I'm just going to make it easy for you to just code. This is not a framework, whereas React.js is a framework, right? It's extremely opinionated on how things should be built, on having factory patterns and injection, and having services and all data sources. So it takes over the entire stack, at least in the front end, on your modeling and all this, right? Whereas React.js doesn't do that at all, right? It only cares about the front end and how to easily render content with data, right? It has no opinion on where you're getting the data, how you're modeling the data, how you're architecting all that. It doesn't care, right? It's not what it's for, right? So it's much more lean. It's just a library, right? It's not an entire framework.
Sorry, Professor, but the former of the two that you just explained, you were talking about Angular, right?
Yes.
Oh, all right, sorry. Thank you.
Yeah, no, I was saying that Angular is very opinionated.
Right, okay, I'm following you.
About how you architect, right, all of the front end, about the data modeling and the typing. Obviously, TypeScript is heavy in Angular, and yeah, and so some developers had some qualms about that. But then when they switched over to React, they found out that they had to rebuild all that. It says, oh, wait a minute, I need state, and I need a service layer to talk to a server, and I need that. So of which Angular, already provided, and had a really strict way of talking to, of architecting that. Whereas here, you kind of can do whatever you want, but it's a little more chaotic then, right? Yeah, and we're going to build everything. Something in chat. Since you mentioned it, could you quickly talk about the different uses of JavaScript and TypeScript? What is their relationship difference? Why haven't it been adopted more broadly and supposed to scale? I think TypeScript is being adopted quite a bit. It's a superset of the JavaScript language, meaning all JavaScript is already TypeScript. It's so it's TypeScript is just JavaScript that you have now added type to the variables. I think they're going through the same growing pains that folks had when they were going from C to C++. There was such a huge amounts of C that had already been written that it took forever, right, to make the switch over to C++. Right, that introduced object orientation, right, and all sorts of great design patterns, but folks were still having like a mixture of writing still C-style programming with C++, right, and there was there were many decades that you had a really ugly mixture of both non-object orientation with object orientation, and you really had to be very rigorous, right, to make sure that you were writing object-oriented in the object-oriented way as opposed to the functional nature of C. And I think that same growing pains is happening in the JavaScript community with going from just plain old JavaScript into TypeScript, especially because you have all these competing libraries. It's so scattered and it's just growing so fast, right? As opposed to just going from C to C++. And it was clearly delineated the path here. You know, there's so many other competing frameworks and so many folks that are trying to play into this arena. It's so much harder to to move forward, right? And to have a clear path, right? Yeah. Let's see, something on the chat. Thanks. All right, yeah. So that's all I had for you today. So on Wednesday we are going to be jumping full on with React.js. We're going to first introduce stateful classes, and then introduce the stateless functions, right? And show you how to write one and the other. And also we'll have a chance to play around with some of the new features such as hooks, use state and use effect and whatnot to have a little bit of the best of both worlds, right? Whereas stateful classes are are heavy or are very verbose, right? Are harder to test. Whereas functions, stateless functions, are much easier to test, but then you don't get any of the lifecycle functions, and you don't get any state whatsoever. And so there's an in between that's a sweet spot that which we'll introduce with hooks. And then we'll move over to using Redux for maintaining state, and centralized state for the application, which I need to warn you that Redux has a very steep learning curve. Right, it has a very steep learning curve, and I'm just trying to manage your expectations. Although it's an extremely popular library. And definitely needs to, anybody who is serious about web development needs to understand Redux and state management and whatnot. But it has a very steep learning curve, and definitely will be an interesting journey. All right, excellent. That's all I have for you. Any questions? All right, folks, that's all I have for you. Thank you.
Thank you, Professor. Have a good night.
Good night. Bye.
Thank you, Professor.
Bye-bye.